Hello everyone, this is G and I'm back with another video. I hope everybody's okay. It's pretty early here in New York City. It's actually about 5:40 in the morning. As you can no doubt tell by how I look and my voice, I'm very tired. I've been going through a lot recently. My family member's back in the hospital. There's a lot going on and it's just a lot to process, and I'm not exactly in the mood right now to talk or think about it. But I wanted to cover something somewhat positive. I know that given that I'm typically very critical of everything, most of my videos are me giving a critical opinion. So I wanted to do something a little bit different, if only just to pull my spirits up and maybe pull your spirits up too, or at least give one person's perspective on this particular question, which is from the MK Habit Addict, CEO of Lin Kuei fans. Okay, well, you're repping Sub-Zero. That's my favorite character from the MK games. So, you kind of got me there. So, the question is best sequels in gaming history, at least between these two, right? Mortal Kombat 2 and Street Fighter 2. Now, I am old enough to have been a little kid when these two games were originally released. MK2 came out, I think, in 94. And Street Fighter 2, I think, was 91, 92, depending on um, where you lived, where you got it, right? Different release dates for different regions of the world. I certainly remember playing it in 1992 when I was 7 years old, right? So there's that. Now, both of these games are incredibly important to their franchises because both of these games are pretty much why the franchise still exists uh, decades later. Right? I think, in fact, this year, I think this October is going to be the 30th anniversary of Mortal Kombat. If you had told me when I was a little kid that when the first MK game dropped in 1992 that it would be here, uh, reboots and two timelines and controversies, and 3 decades later, I would not have believed you. I don't think I could even imagine 30 years in the future. At that time, I was 7, right? And then, of course, you had Street Fighter 2, which is actually a little bit older because the first Street Fighter game, I think, came out around 87 or 88, right? So it's actually, so Street Fighter now is 30 plus years old. I think it's around 35, 36 years old, something around there in the mid 30s. It's about as old as I am. Right, so I think if you had told me when I was a little kid that either one of these franchises that I was literally growing up with were still going to be around, um, I wouldn't have believed you. Even as I got older, I wouldn't have believed you. Especially with Mortal Kombat, because Mortal Kombat for a long time relied on its gimmick, right? The whole blood and the violence, right? That's what got everybody's attention, right? Like, even back in the day, people talked about how glitchy it was, how the controls weren't all that great at times, right? So if I if there was any fighting game franchise that I thought was gonna die out after its boon of popularity, it was gonna be Mortal Kombat because it was always very gimmicky by design, right? Whereas Street Fighter, always had the better mechanics, and pretty much every 2D fighter, every Japanese anime based fighter ever since then has basically taken the groundwork gameplay wise that Street Fighter 2 created and built from that. So I definitely thought that Mortal Kombat was going to die out over the years. And I have no problem admitting that. Even as an MK fan, I thought the series was done. I wanted it to be done after Armageddon. They had literally marketed Armageddon, which came out in 2006, I believe, as the last Mortal Kombat game. And having played Armageddon, it was just a souped-up version of MK Trilogy with some mini games, and I was happy with it. And then they did the reboot, and and it's been going on for about 10 or so years now, right? Although to be fair, prior to the reboot, they did they kind of put feelers out with MK versus DC and all that before they actually did the reboot in 2011. But now the reboot's been on for what 11 years now, I think, right? So again, for all my criticisms of Mortal Kombat and of Ed Boon and the writing and the characters and Sindel and everything else and Jax, I got to give credit where credit's due. The franchise has existed for pretty much as long as I have. We're both still alive, so I have to give them credit. But now to sort of address this question of which is better, right? What's the better sequel? For me, having played both games, having played every game up until a certain point that followed, with Mortal Kombat, I played every major title from the first game to Armageddon. So I haven't played any of the games in the sequel trilogy. In the reboot trilogy, I should say. 2011 all, right? So 92 to 2006, it's well over a decade, right? And then with Street Fighter, I played every major Street Fighter title up until Street Fighter 4. That was the last one I played. Kind of lost interest after that. But that's a fair amount, right? And it certainly falls within this framework here of the early 1990s titles. So if I had to choose uh, which one is the better sequel, although to be clear, they're both incredibly important to their franchises because both games laid the groundwork for their franchises, right? But if I had to choose, um, I would say Street Fighter 2 was the better sequel, and I'll explain why. Now, before I go into that, I want to be clear. I have a bias towards Street Fighter 2. That is my favorite game of all time. I'm going to try to make a logical argument as to why it's the better sequel because of what it did for its franchise, but I'm not going to lie. Street Fighter 2, especially the Genesis version, is my favorite video game of all time. You can't tell me, you cannot convince me that there's a better fighting game or a better game ever made. There have been amazing sequels, right? There was Super Metroid was an amazing sequel to the Metroid games. Streets of Rage 2 was an amazing sequel for Streets of Rage. There are many great video games out there, many great sequel titles. Best video game ever for me is Street Fighter 2 Special Champions Edition, the Genesis version. You'll never convince me different. So I just want to be clear. And with Mortal Kombat, my favorite Mortal Kombat and the games that made me a Mortal Kombat fan are MK3 and MK Trilogy. So I do have a bias here, but I am going to try to make as logical an argument as I can for both titles and explain why I think Street Fighter 2, when compared to MK2, was the better sequel. Street Fighter 2 basically is the birth of Street Fighter. Now, let me explain what I mean. There is a Street Fighter game, there is a SF1, but the problem is that SF1 is completely disconnected from what became Street Fighter. And what's worse is that it's an objectively, and I've played it. I'm not speaking as someone who's just heard or seen videos or read reviews. I've played the game. That game is just the first Street Fighter game, SF1. It's just objectively bad. It has the controls are clunky. The special moves are next to impossible to perform. The collision, right, or like the amount of damage you take when you get hit, especially with a special move, is just completely bonkers. Basically, a fireball or two, and you're done. Right? The controls are just completely whack, even for a late 80s fighting game. It is just simply a bad game. And the only reason why I think you don't hear as much about how objectively bad the first Street Fighter game is because I think a lot of people simply don't know about it. It didn't get a lot of attention at that time, right? Even in like Street Fighter lore. When most people talk about like their first Street Fighter game or like the beginning of the franchise, they will almost always show Street Fighter 2, right? So the first Street Fighter game for many people effectively is just discount continuity. It doesn't exist anymore. No one counts it. And I think that's the only reason why people don't mention just how objectively bad a game it was. But then you look at certain character designs from that game, like, Ryu. He's got this. He looks more like Jin from like Yu Yu Hakusho in the first Street Fighter game than he does Ryu, right? He has this red hair and white headband, and he just looks weird, right? Street Fighter 2, though, was a complete overhaul, right? It was just like, again, the first game is like it's never existed. They rebuilt Street Fighter from the ground up with Street Fighter 2. New controls, better controls, anime inspired art style, right? The whole, international tournament thing. They brought back characters like Sagat, who's the boss from the first game. Most of the characters from the first game would not come back, or they would come back later. For example, Gen wouldn't be introduced again until the Alpha series, right? And certain characters, like there was a ninja character in the first Street Fighter game. He never came back, but his role more or less was just taken by Vega, right? But basically, the Street Fighter 2 games, because there were several games, right? You had like the World Warrior, where you had like 8 characters and you couldn't play as the Grandmasters, and then you had like Street Fighter 2 Dash, which is where they expanded it, right? And you could play as the Grandmasters, who were the bosses of the game. But everything from the graphics to the gameplay to the hit collision to the special moves, everything just got rehauled, right? And that is the game that serves as the base for Street Fighter. Street Fighter begins at Street Fighter 2. It doesn't begin at Street Fighter 1. Street Fighter 2 is the ground floor. It's the first game of Street Fighter that is worth playing, quite frankly. And because it was just this perfect storm, right? Great controls, characters, interesting story, great graphics, an amazing soundtrack, regardless of which system you play it on. Although I will admit I have a bias, and I think the Genesis version of the soundtrack is just like godly. But that game is Street Fighter. It became everything that the franchise represents. And as somebody who played every major Street Fighter title up until Street Fighter 4, I can tell you, every Street Fighter game since is basically some sort of recreation of Street Fighter 2. And I have no doubt that 5 and Super 5 or whatever they're up to now are more or less the same thing. Every Street Fighter game past that is basically trying to redo 2. Right? That's probably the one, I wouldn't call it a downside, but there probably is the one, I don't know how to term it. But the thing is that every game since, at least the ones that I played, is basically trying to be an updated, upgraded version of Street Fighter 2. Right? They add more characters, they added more Ryu type characters like Sakura and Akuma, and then they had Sean in Street Fighter 3 and all that. And that's great, right? But every game is just basically taking taking Street Fighter 2 and just trying to present it to you in a different way. But if you've played Street Fighter 2, you've played every Street Fighter game, right? There's nothing all that fundamentally different, right? Of course, a lot of the games later on with Super and everything, brought in super moves and specials and all that, right? But basically, every Street Fighter game is just a souped-up version of SF2, right? So there's that. So that's why I think it's the better sequel, because it became the groundwork for the franchise as a whole. Because the first game gave them absolutely nothing to work with. Now, Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2, while a very important sequel, right? Mortal Kombat 2, I would say, built on what the first game gave them, right? It didn't have this sort of starting on the basement level type of situation that Street Fighter 2 had, with the first game being an absolute clunker. The first Mortal Kombat game, which I have played, I've shown it in videos, right, is a solid game. And Mortal Kombat 2 builds on that. What Mortal Kombat 2 did, in my personal opinion, is that it created the atmosphere that Mortal Kombat would become known for, especially in its 90s heyday. The thing is that visually, if you've ever seen it, Mortal Kombat 2 and the first Mortal Kombat game visually are totally different, right? The first Mortal Kombat game is brighter. Even the attraction screen, right? It's bright red. It's got this gold bordering. It's got the word Mortal Kombat in the middle, right? It's very 1970s kung fu funk, right? Which makes sense because a lot of the original game was inspired by films like Enter the Dragon, right? But Mortal Kombat 2, visually, right, atmosphere-wise, artistic-wise, did away with a lot of the 70s kitsch look, right? Like the intro. Oh, what's funny is that Super Street Fighter 2. Super Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat 2 have very similar intros if you let the intro animation play, right? There's lightning, and you have in the Super Street Fighter 2 one, you have like Ryu, this fighting stance and everything, right? Both games, they were like, we're darker now, right? But with Mortal Kombat 2, I would say Mortal Kombat 2 sort of set the stage, right? It set the stage, it created the atmosphere that the franchise would become famous for. But it built on a decent ground base because the first MK game already had the kitschy, gimmicky element with the fatalities and the blood and everything, which was censored in the NES and Genesis versions of the games. But the difference was that the Genesis version had a code. It had a code, and you could go into the options, and if you knew the code, I think it was called Dullard. Um, you could unlock the blood, but I don't think you could do that for the Super NES version. So the Super NES version is unique in that it was the first Mortal Kombat title, at least that I know of, that Nintendo released uncensored. When MK2 came out, both versions on the Genesis and the Super NES version were uncensored. The blood was left in, the fatalities were left in. You have to remember, this is when Nintendo was very much, on their family-friendly game. So to release this violent, gory uh, uh, video game completely uncensored, and you're like the family-friendly company, was a big deal, right? Because their whole thing, like the commercial said, was that Genesis does what Nintendo don't, right? Genesis was like for the older players, the more edgy players, and Nintendo was your family friendly company. So for them to do that was a big deal, and it shows the power of a successful franchise. To have a company like Nintendo, in a sense, bend the knee back then and release the game unaltered. But the first Mortal Kombat game already introduced an interesting cast of characters, interesting bosses and sub bosses, interesting stages, and I would say workable, workable, um, uh, serviceable control scheme, right? As somebody who played every game in the original franchise, in the original timeline, the controls were never all that great, but they were serviceable, right? So there was already a lot of groundwork that was set by the first game, and MK2 built on that, right? It built on that, which is good. MK2 is where you get a lot of the Outworld stages because the tournament takes place in Outworld in that one. So stuff like the Living Forest, the Jesus, what is it? The other ones, the Living Forest, the Deadpool, the Armory, the Portal, all these stages that have made comebacks later, multiple times throughout the franchise. Started in that game. A lot of characters that are very iconic now, in particular Kitana, Melina, Kung Lao, right? Young Shang Tsung. Reptile became playable in that game after being a hidden character in the first game. Right, so a lot of iconic characters were introduced or reintroduced, right, in the case of the original seven fighters, of who only five were actually playable. As some may or may not know, Kano and Sonia are not playable in Mortal Kombat 2. They're part of the story. They're literally part of the background in Khan's arena. They're shown to be chained and trapped there. And the story works them in by saying that, they've been kidnapped and Jax has to go rescue Sonya and arrest Kano and all this other stuff. But the reason why Sonya and Kano are literally background characters in that game is because they were the least two played characters from the first game. And at the time, you know, NetherRealm, Midway back then, Boone and Tobias, they weren't sure whether or not they wanted to cut the characters because they only had so much space. They wanted to really introduce more new characters, but they wanted to bring the original roster back. But it's like, okay, what do we do with these two characters who they eventually, you know, those slots that like Kano and Sonya would have gotten, that went to Kitana and Melina, right? But so what they did was they literally wrote them in as background characters to keep them part of the story, but they weren't playable, and they used them as inspiration for Jax, who was introduced in MK2, right? But trilogy, not trilogy. MK2 is also where we get characters like the current Sub Zero, right? It's where we get good guy mentor Raiden because Raiden was an evil character in the first game, and a lot of stuff, right? A lot of stuff that would become sort of canonized throughout the games and more or less maintained originates with that game. So while Street Fighter 2 created a franchise, Mortal Kombat 2 gave Mortal Kombat its identity, right? It wasn't just this kitschy kung fu game anymore that had blood, guts, and violence. It now, at least in my opinion, had a story, right? It had a story. It was a bit more than just its gimmick. Its gimmick was still very much there, but now they actually had some meat to it, right? So it built upon a solid foundation. It was able to again build on it and continue, and they would do the same thing with 3 and with trilogy and 4 and all this other stuff. I will say this much though. See, the Mortal Kombat sequel titles from this are not just reattempts or rehashes at MK2. Although for many people, especially of my generation, MK2 is for a lot of people their favorite Mortal Kombat game of the 2D era. Fine, I was 3. But I will give NetherRealm Studios credit for trying to be innovative. They always sort of get, razzed uh, for the whole palette swap of the ninjas thing and all that. And fair enough, but that was very much just a result of, using digitized graphics, which was very new at the time, having very limited resources, using real actors and actresses, stuntmen and whatnot to portray these characters and everything. So it's sort of just a result of the time and the situation they were in. But I would say, especially control wise, um, while the controls were never all that great, Street Fighter 2 has the better control scheme. MK2, or just MK in general, has tried to evolve in different ways. They're not necessarily trying to rehash MK2, right? They added things like the aggression meter and like a run or running attack in 3 in Trilogy. They went 3D in 4, and they introduced weapons. And then you had the 3D era, right? Deception, Deadly Alliance, those titles where they introduced actual interchangeable martial arts styles, and they expanded upon the weapons thing, and they've sort of built more on that, especially in from what I've seen in the sequel trilogy, right? They've sort of kept those elements that were introduced later, than try to really recreate anything or carry anything on, at least mechanics wise, from the 2D era, right? So I do think that is one positive. They actually did try to evolve their control scheme over the years, and they did try to make different types of games as opposed to just trying to recreate their best title over and over and over and over and over again. So I will give them, for all of my issues with Boone and NetherRealm, I'll give them that much. They weren't just trying to rehash and recreate a certain title 100 times over like Capcom has with Street Fighter 2. But yeah, if I had to choose, and again, both are great games. I've played them both. I love them both. Um, Again, Street Fighter 2 because it saved the franchise. MK2 built on the foundation that MK1 provided it with. It added more, right? There was now more to this franchise, more to this story. Street Fighter 1 is such a bad game that you're basically starting with one foot in the grave. And Street Fighter 2 came in and said, no, we're pulling that foot out of the grave and we're going to jump high into the sky and become one of the most iconic video games of all time. And it did. So, again, for reasons I hope I have explained as logically as I can, Street Fighter 2 is the better sequel and the more important sequel for its franchise than MK2 was. Because Street Fighter 2 is the franchise, and MK2 built on the foundations of a burgeoning franchise. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. But anyway, that's the video. Please let me know what you think, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a good day or night wherever you are. Bye.